Guy Ritchie's latest film tells the story of the first ever Special Forces unit formed during World War II. It is based upon recently declassified documents from the British War Museum and tells what it claims to be is a true story. But we'll get into that in a minute. Hello, and welcome back to another installment of Film Friday, in which I review a new film every single week. This week we are looking at the 2024 film, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, directed by Guy Ritchie and starring Henry Cavill. Let's get into it. The film itself was quite enjoyable, although certainly not Guy Ritchie's finest work, and it suffered somewhat from pacing, especially in the middle. It also contained arguably one of the worst performances of Winston Churchill I have ever seen in a film, which would have been fine if that character had only appeared for a few minutes at the beginning, but he kept reappearing throughout the film, and it was always quite jarring when he did. There was also far too much exposition. I think it's fair to assume that about 90% of the people who chose to go watch this particular film already had a basic understanding of how and why World War II started. So while it isn't necessarily bad to include a reminder to help set the scene, this film contained what felt like a 10-minute summary of what happened during World War II. And the dialogue, unfortunately, was one of the weakest points of this film. There was far too much repetition. As the audience, you ended up hearing the same information repeated 3 to 5 times as it was passed along from character to character. And while it might be realistic that that's how the information would have been passed and the conversations would have been repeated over and over again in real life, in a film it's not necessary to do that, and it just makes the plot drag. And the writers didn't even try to hide it. Oftentimes, the information would be repeated using the same exact phrase over and over again. For example, I think I heard the phrase, "This is an unsanctioned military operation," repeated at least 5 times by 5 different characters in the span of like 30 minutes. It is true that one could use that kind of repetition for a dramatic purpose, especially if it was only employed 1 or 2 times throughout the film, but this was fairly constant and it didn't seem to serve any purpose. However, that said, there were some elements of this film that were quite good. The cinematography was well done, and there were some excellent shots without the camera work unnecessarily distracting you from the film. The action sequences are a good example of this. The editing work was also on point for most of the film, especially for the montage sequences towards the end. And I had a somewhat similar reaction to the soundtrack. It was good, and at times it was very good, but at other moments it didn't feel quite right. Going back to the pacing of the film, which I touched upon earlier, I think this was the main reason why I wasn't as impressed by this film as I thought I was going to be, based upon previous works by Guy Ritchie. The pacing wasn't consistent throughout. Now, I don't mean by that a film should be constantly fast-paced or slow-paced without any deviation in between them for the entire duration of a film in order to be good. Of course not. That would not be a well-paced movie. But for the start of the film, it went something like this. Some action, a bit of setup, things moved a bit slower, and then some more action. But then we got into the middle of the film, the main bulk of the movie, and things slowed down incredibly. It seemed like this slowdown, this break, was to set up the next piece of action. But there was only one more piece, the final montage of the film, and while that certainly was well done, it took way too long to get there. And the quality of this film overall was quite similar to this pacing structure. Chunks of it were quite good, and then other chunks just weren't. However, with all that said, let us now turn to look at the historical side of this story. I did some research and reading into a book entitled Secret War Heroes by Marcus Binney. In this book, he recounts Gus March Phillips' own version of these events, and it turns out that a good chunk of this film was heavily fictionalized, although the main events did occur. For instance, in real life, when they took over that ship, the Duchess, there was very little resistance given to them, and it was very easy to commandeer the ship, whereas in the film, a heavy battle ensues between 3 men against 50 soldiers. Also, when they blow the anchor of the Duchess in order to steer it out of port, this causes a large and loud explosion, which in the film brought every soldier on the island rushing to the shore to try to stop them. But in reality, those on shore heard the explosion and thought an air raid had begun, so they went to hide in underground bunkers and find shelter from the bombs there. And so little to no resistance was actually given to these soldiers as they were stealing the Duchess. However, despite these historical inaccuracies, it wasn't a terrible film overall, and I would rate it a 7 out of 10. With that being said, thank you for watching. Be sure to comment your own thoughts on this film below, and don't forget to subscribe for more movie reviews and commentary.